Today we have as guest Professor Raffaele Scuderi, full professor of economic policy at University of Enna, Core. His research interest is various is tourism and cultural economics, but also economic growth and convergence. I'm Alessandro Crociata, assistant professor at GSSI, and it's my due to remember the rules of the games. So the webinars will take 1 hour for the presentation, and then we stop for 5 minutes, and then we have a question time, and we hope you have some question to put to Professor Scuderi. Another thing is that the webinar will be recorded. So if you have any problem with this, please move to our YouTube channel that hosts the seminar as well. So please, Raffaele, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Just give me a couple of minutes to share, of seconds to share my screen. So it took less than 2 minutes. I'm grateful to GSSI for this invitation, and I thank you, Alessandro, very much for chairing my webinar. Thank you also to my colleagues and friends, Alessandra Faggiani and Sandro Montresor, who invited me for this seminar. I would like to start by telling you how this research I'm going to present today was born. As you can see from the first slide, it is a joint paper, it is a joint work with Enrico Bertacchini and Chiara Dalle Nogare. Me and my colleagues have been discussing, making research about cultural economics and the role of museums in cultural economics. We have done it for several years, but in 2018, the media came with this news. Well, in 2018, an Italian party, the representatives, or at least the local section of Fratelli d'Italia party, which in English sounds like Brothers of Italy, complained about a policy that was a promotion policy that was introduced by the Egyptian Museum in Turin. Basically, what the museums did was to give a sort of reduction, sort of discount, a 2-for-1 admission to Arab speakers. Actually, this kind of policy was part of a broader set of policies that was set up by the museum itself. But you know, this party, this right-wing party, Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, has an Italy first agenda. So consistently with that, they complained about the presence of policy of a targeted policy to immigrants and especially to Arab speakers. Following this, a couple of months ago, later, a newspaper, Il Giornale dell'Arte, which is the Italian edition of the arts newspaper, published 2 articles. The first one, the one in the top left panel, discusses, surveys some of the best practices of museums in promoting the integration between natives and immigrants. And in the bottom right panel, there is another article published still in April 2018, showing that this kind of integration policies in museums are quite widespread across Europe. So the Egyptian Museum of Turin was alone in promoting an integration policy for immigrants. The Giornale dell'Arte showed that this practice is actually quite widespread across Italy and Europe as well. So after hearing this news, we actually had a look at the data coming from the Italian census of museums promoted and made by Istat and the Ministry for Culture. This questionnaire reported a specific question asking the museum whether they had implemented a promotion policy targeted at immigrants. And we noticed that different museums decided to do so. So we asked ourselves, but to what extent an exogenous message like the one carried by a political party can be influential to a cultural institution like a museum in order to address these integration policies? Is there any influence that comes from the external side for the cultural institution to design integration, this kind of integration policy? Indeed, this is quite a timely question because the flows of migrants have increased and have been intense at the global level. It is quite recognized by the academic literature that immigrants are a potential resource for hosting communities. But as I will present later, this very much depends on the composition and on the kind of integration policy that is set. Integration policy, we notice that museums are quite active in doing this. But our question is there any influence by the native sentiment towards immigration? We all know that a political party interprets a sentiment that is present in a population. Is it influential to museums to design integration policies? More broadly, our discussion tries to see if there is an impact of the political sentiment on actually implemented policies. Is there a concrete impact of the voice of the people mediated through the political party, of course? Our work, in the end, is in the spirit of this piece by Schumacher and Van Kersbergen I mentioned in the slide. They basically, they point out that there is an impact of the political sentiment on actual policies, irrespectively of the fact that anti-immigrant parties are on power. So the voice of the voters is somehow functional to shape some kind of integration policy. We will see if this happens in the case of a cultural institution like the museum. We surveyed the literature, and we believe that ours is the first quantitative contribution on the topic of on museums and immigrants. There have been case studies that were published in journals, but we tried to see if some generalization can come out. One of the negative aspects of our paper is that, okay, we made a test based on data, but our data has a cross-sectional structure, so we cannot detect causal relationships. But we believe that our paper, our research is still a starting point for further discussion about what we find. And what we found, the main result was that there is a negative and robust and significant and persistent throughout our models negative correlation between the share of votes to Lega Nord, which has an anti-immigrants agenda, and the implementation of pro-migrants policies in Italian museums. What we do from a more technical point of view is to investigate the factors, the determinants of the probability for a museum to engage with the pro-immigrants policies. We do it in a twofold way. The first one is to estimate a model where we face the museum's commitment to migrants integrations with the possible reaction of native visitors and patrons. On the other side, we empirically test our model and our guess from the study of the literature. And if on the one side, we find no robust evidence of the population size on the policies, that is, the policies are likely to take place irrespectively of the size of the migrant population. This is what we find in the end. But again, we find an interesting correlation between the commitment of museums and the political sentiment, which is, of course, worthwhile, in our opinion, to be investigated more in depth, maybe with more data that may allow to detect causal relationships. Migration in the economic literature has been proven to give a positive contribution to hosting regions of countries. Ottaviano and Peri, in two papers, find basically a net positive effect of immigration and cultural diversity on productivity of both natives and firms as well. The second paper I'm mentioning here, the one of Bhuptane et al., point out that migrants have a positive effect on GDP, on both GDP per capita and GDP per worker. And what is interesting is that this impact happens even when migratory policies are non-selective. That is, you don't need to have a selective policy to have a possibly positive impact on GDP per capita and per worker in the long run. This is very interesting. And the third point, here I'm presenting a selection of three aspects, but as you can imagine, the literature is very well populated by very interesting researchers on the topic. The third topic I'm mentioning is about search frictions and welfare, the one of Battisti and others. Basically, they find that it is a paper on the labor market. And what they found was that the migrants attenuate the effects of the natives' search frictions. And overall, the welfare increases for both high and low skilled natives. Another type of positive contribution of migrants then. The positive contribution of migrants depends indeed on the characteristics of the migrant population, and also on the type of integration policies that is implemented and its type. Because depending on the characteristics of migrants and the kind of policy, very different equilibria may be reached. Here I'm mentioning some, again, three papers mentioning these, discussing this point. For instance, Alessandra Fangiani and others found a sort of substitution effect between migrants and natives in the labor market. Algan and others point out that assimilation patterns between migrants and natives are quite heterogeneous, but in most of the cases, convergence of immigrants' behaviors to those of natives takes place, which is an interesting point. Again, Battisti and others, Basile and others, this is a quite recent paper published in 2020, find a sort of displacement effect between migrants and low-skilled natives, but complementarity between migrants and high-skilled workers. So there is a sort of competition between migrants and natives, but it seems to depend on the kind of skill of the native population. So it seems the migrants are likely to compete with a precise share of a precise cluster of the population. In any case, some contribution, especially the one of I'm mentioning of Bradstein and Justman, point out that laissez-faire policies may not lead to a desirable outcome. There should be an active intervention of policies designed at the integration of migrants. Literature has also pointed out that the higher the immigration rates, the higher the anti-immigrant sentiment in the population. And this leads to the rise of parties that oppose integration. One very cited contribution is one of Otto and Steinhardt, who point out that there is an impact of migration on the political success of right-wing parties in Germany. But this happens because natives are concerned about the negative implications for welfare and local amenities of the increasing migrant population. Another contribution on Norway, authored by Sorensen, points out that the success of right-wing party is positively correlated with the increase in migrant population, but this is basically due to cultural resentment and less related to concerns on employment or welfare. And what is interesting is that when the relative size of the migrant population increases, Sorensen finds that this concern decreases. So if the migrant population grows in size, it's like the natives are aware that are less concerned about the increase of the migrant population. The third point was raised by Barone and others who made a paper on Italy. What they found was that those municipalities that experienced relatively large arrivals of migrants tended to vote for the center-right coalition. But again, this sort of concern for migrants is explained basically by a concern on cultural diversity and partly by global market competition with natives, and also by the access to public services, which is another interesting point I will point out later. The last contribution is by Guiso and others, who found that insecurity from exposing to globalization and competition of immigrants are drivers for the demand of the populist vote. Museums here have the role of cultural institutions indeed, but at the same time, in general, when government and markets fail, non-profit organizations enter to provide collective goods targeted at specific segments of the population. Actually, non-profit organizations have been proven to be superior providers of this kind of collective goods for specific segments of the population. Museums are predominantly non-profit organizations, regardless of their structure, either public or private. So we may guess well that more immigrants should lead museums to consider providing them ad hoc goods to design appropriate policies for the integration, as museums behave like non-profit organizations, basically, as the literature has pointed out. So this is one first justification for the active role of museums in promoting integration policies. But I will be more specific later. Indeed, as given the role of non-profit organizations, but of cultural institutions, of institutions that want to promote integration policies, indeed, the museum and heritage institutions target maybe the one related to educational and intercultural dialogue. So this is why museums may be interested in promoting integration policies. But at the same time, on the other side, political preferences of natives might discourage their willingness to pursue this kind of policies. Anti-immigrant sentiments actually can give to, in theory, to two opposite reactions. The first one can be to ask for more integration policies. So more immigrants, more policies, because people may ask for more integration by with the migrant population. On the other side, it might take to the aversion towards such policies. But let's discuss this point with specific attention to the kind of service provided by the museums to integrate migrant population, and in the light of the academic literature. The integration policies promoted by museums can be seen as a type of redistribution policies, especially when initiatives involve only immigrants. In general, some contributions have proven that there is a negative relationship between the size of the immigrant community and natives' preferences for redistribution. So the higher, the bigger the immigrant community, the higher the preference of natives, the lower the preference of natives for redistribution. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the local population can have concerns because of the growth of the migrant population. And this leads to an aversion to redistribution policies targeted at immigrants. The second point, reasoned by some contributors like Brady and Finnegan, the one I'm reporting here, is the welfare chauvinism point. The point is that more immigrants, these authors find that more immigrants do not trigger aversion towards the welfare state in general, but specifically to expenditure targeted at them. If we instead mean in a second way the type of integration policies promoted by museums, if we mean them not as we have done so far, as a sort of redistribution policy, but instead as a policy that wants to promote the intercultural dialogue, so between natives and migrants, so the involvement of both the populations, this has proven to lead to some episodes of xenophobia or defense of national culture. Natives may fear the deterioration of the cultural dimension and of their subjective well-being. There might be the concern of the population, by the population side, called compositional amenities concern, which is basically a concern on a concern about the fact that services targeted at the population in a broader sense may deteriorate over time. So this concern comes from a fear by the local population that if they share this service with the migrant population, the quality of the services in general provided by local policymakers can deteriorate. And In any case, we might well argue that reading the literature, there is support to state that a strong local anti-immigrant sentiment can be associated to lower probabilities for a museum to engage this kind of audience. Because as we will show in our theoretical model, museums, curators, managers are very much careful of the audience reaction, because besides the cultural objective of the institutions, they also care of the number of visitors, which is a source of revenues for them. I will briefly present our simple theoretical model, which starts from the contribution of Hasman and Throsby. These authors try to depict in a theoretical way the behavior and the choices of non-profit cultural organizations. We already mentioned that museums are two non-profit cultural organizations. And so this model can be applied to museums too, but with some caveats. I will tell you which ones later. The utility function of cultural organizations depends basically on two elements. That is the admissions, which measures the impact of the organization on the audience, and the quality of the provided service. Every non-profit cultural organization, of course, is subject to financial constraints, because costs must be covered by revenues. And these revenues come essentially from entrance fees of the audience, but also they come from public or private grants. The grants, according to the model, depend on quality, because there is a sort of feedback effect from impact of quality changes on donors' choices. So if donors are aware that quality is not that good, they decide to decrease the amount of the grant. We change a bit the model, because we believe the price is really a choice variable in the museum industry. So we set it equal to 1. We don't refer to quality in general, but only to programs engaging immigrant audience. And we assume the directors consider these programs as directly affecting the utility. And this is explained by the fact that we are, after all, we are talking about Mary goods. They may care of the programs because of the warm glow phenomenon. They may care about the reputation of their actions within the community of museum directors. But at the same time, the implementation of these programs might also affect the behavior of patrons and visitors. Their behavior is a direct proxy of the social impact of the museum's action. So we have two elements, not only policies for immigrants, but also the reaction of the public in general, of the audience and of the patrons. This is our theoretical model. Again, the utility depends, is function of the programs, but also of the visits of natives and immigrants. And the budget constraint accounts for the number of visits and the grants received by the museum, and accounts also for the costs of managing a museum. The utility, we set the utility as increasing in the two types of audiences. We set the utility as increasing with the number of actions targeted at immigrants, but at a decreasing pace. We set the immigrants' demand as non-decreasing in Q. But now we consider how all these models can be affected by a negative reaction of locals. So after setting the first order conditions, we propose two scenarios. The first scenario is the one where there's no response of locals. When locals are quite non-respondent, so are quite neutral, let's say, to policies targeted at immigrants, the idea, such neutrality, so no response is not that correct. I would rather say neutrality of locals, neutrality in general in the response to these actions. The model generates a Q star number of actions in case of neutrality towards these actions. But in the second scenario, we see what happens when locals are hostile. When locals are hostile, so when there is an anti-immigrant sentiment, the idea number of actions is lower than the theoretical number of actions that we found in the previous scenario. That is, when there is a neutrality of a neutral reaction, there is a Q star number. This number is lower in case there is a negative reaction by the locals. So this leads us to set an hypothesis to test through our data. That is, a higher local anti-immigration sentiment is associated to a weaker commitment of a museum to immigrant integration. The higher the anti-immigrant sentiment, the lower the number of integration policies that museums will set. The second hypothesis comes from introducing the relative size of the immigrant community. And our model predicts that the larger the local immigrant community, the greater that commitment for a museum to promote integration policies. So this model predicts that there is a direct proportionality between the number of the relative size of the immigrant population and the number of integration policies that are managed by museums. But let's see what happens with the data. Before doing this, I would like to briefly depict what has been the Italian context. We are testing this model through, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we will use a data set coming from the 2015 museum census, which is a very large data set including more than 4,000 museums. So we will focus specifically on Italy. And this is why now I will sketch some a brief picture about what happens in Italy in the aspects I just mentioned. Let us talk a bit on the immigration phenomenon in Italy. In Italy, inflows of migrants, receiving inflows of migrants is overall a relatively new phenomenon, because over most of the 20th century, Italy has faced immigration and internal migration flows coming, from southern regions to northern regions, because of the well-known divide between south and north of Italy. But since the 80s, the situation has changed. Italy has turned into a destination country. In the last 2 decades, flows have grown steadily with a high annual growth rate. And this has made Italy one of the European countries that has experienced the largest inflow of migrants, both in absolute terms and as a share of the resident population. Let's look at some numbers. The share of the legal immigrants has improved from 0% in 1991 to 8.9% in 2014. That is, in 2014, it was 12% of the total workforce. Migrants, the gender composition is quite balanced between males and females. Migrants have a lower level of education than the natives and a much younger age. Most of the foreigners residing in Italy are first generation because of the relative novelty of the immigration phenomenon with such big numbers in Italy. And the literature points out a sort of subordinate integration of migrants in Italy. which derives from the fact that there is a high level market segmentation along ethnic lines. There is an occupational segregation in lowest layers, and migrants have very low occupational and social mobility. As to parties, the anti-immigration feelings grew with the rise of numbers of immigrants, and so did the anti-immigrants parties. They have and still they have voiced and still they voice in full the anti-immigrants sentiment. With this regard, the Chapel Hill Expert Survey finds some parties that in Italy are, well known for their position against immigration. In 2014, they found that Lega Nord, Fratelli d'Italia, and Forza Italia, all parties belong to the right-wing coalition, had anti-immigrants agenda, with Lega Nord being the party that had the most pronounced agenda against immigrants, followed by Fratelli d'Italia and then Forza Italia. I'm mentioning 2014 data because our data set, our survey is our data comes from 2015. So we took a survey which from a time point of view is quite close to the one of our data. Movimento 5 Stelle. This is another well-known party which now currently is on power because it belongs to the government coalition supporting President Giuseppe Conte. Movimento 5 Stelle had a non-clear position towards immigration. There are some signs, there have been some signs of anti-immigrants sentiment, but their position is not that clear actually. We will introduce the Movimento 5 Stelle in our test to see whether they are associated with a more or less pronounced effect on the museum policies. Let's say a couple of words of museums, which are the backbone of Italy's cultural policy. Heritage is by far the most important spending item for culture, where museums, and by museums, in museums I include also monuments and archaeological sites. So museums have the lion's share. They account for the biggest relative share of spending. In Italy, cultural centers are not that widespread, so museums often are substitutes for cultural centers, and this explains this is a feature that explains their commitment to immigrant policies. According to the 2015 census, reading this data, which surveys nearly 5,000 museums, museums are quite dispersed across Italy. They are both located in big and small municipalities, in both urban and non-urban contexts. They are mainly related to public institutions. And the majority of public institutions are, that hold a museum are municipalities governments. From the point of view of the other side of the type of ownership, private museums are a miscellany of very different institutions. 1/3 of private museums are owned by the Catholic Church. The remainder are owned by banking foundations, non-profit organizations, individual lovers, etc. What I want to point out here, we already did it in a previous paper, is the managing and ownership structure of museums. As one can realize by himself, private museums are generally responsible. The management of private museums is responsible for both cultural and financial operations, whereas on the public museum side, up until the mid-90s, they had no budget autonomy, and they depended financially by the cultural department they belonged to. But then after the mid-90s, after the museums reform, a number of public museums turned into autonomous or outsourced, with some possibility to handle the budget. We will account for the type of ownership to explain the kind of initiative for immigrants in museums in our empirical test that will follow. The commitment of museums to social inclusion is not new, because as in the second slide I showed you today, I reported an article from Giornale dell'Arte, which reports a lot of examples of social inclusion of immigrants because of actions promoted by museums. So that this kind of commitment is quite well widespread across museums. But there can be found a great variability with respect to this, because often museums respond to the social vocation of the area. I'm meaning, for instance, museums in tourist areas, which tend to engage in some promotion policies less than others. This kind of promotion policy is quite various. Giornale dell'Arte reports all these best practices and mentions, for instance, reduced fees, as the Egyptian Museum of Turin did, the guided tours, workshops, conferences, ad hoc projects, involvement of schools, etc. So this kind of engagement is quite various across museums. Let us give a brief sketch of our econometric model. Well, our response variable is the answer to a specific question of the survey. The survey asked whether the museum had implemented a promotion policy targeted at foreign residents in 2015. So it is a dichotomous variable, which will be explained by four types of regressors. The first one measures the size of the foreign population. The second one is a set of measures for the political support for parties. Both the foreign residents variables and the political sentiments variables are considered at municipality level. And the municipality level are relevant as local contexts for the immigration phenomenon, as Barone et al. Pointed out in 2016. We also consider a set of cover rates measuring proxy museums' characteristics and other proxies for the local context. Overall, we have more than 2,000 observations dispersed in about 1,200 municipalities. And I would like to point out one important thing. The questionnaire asks for questions on the financial sources of the museum, but the answers to these questions were not available in the database distributed by the Italian Statistical Office. So we don't have information on the financial sources of each museum. But we might guess that each museum had the financial source to promote integration policies for migrants, because a set of questions on whether the museum implemented some promotion policy for a specific category are present in the questionnaire, and all museums that are considered in our dataset implemented at least one promotion policy for a specific category, minor-aged, elderly, disabled people, etc. So if they promoted at least one initiative for one category, we may argue that they had the financial means to expand the promotion policy to other categories. As to the political sentiment, we'll consider, based on the Chapel Hill survey I just mentioned, we will we are introducing some measures reporting the vote shares of Lega Nord, belonging to the center-right coalition, and we will consider in the implosion of the votes of other right-wing parties, Popolo della Libertà, Fratelli d'Italia, and La Destra. They all had an Italy first agenda, and we will also test the role of Five Star Movement, whose position on the immigration has not always been clear. We take the data of the 2013 national elections for the Chamber of Deputies. We exclude in our dataset the small electoral district of Val d'Aosta because they basically had independentist parties, which could hardly be categorized into the three categories I just reported. As to foreign residents in the municipality, we proxy the number of immigrants, but the share of legal foreign residents on total municipal population, plus its quadratic specification. We will stress our main model by testing other versions of other types of proxies, like the growth of local immigrant community, the immigrants' origins, and a measure of fractionalization. So we will try to see if the robustness in results of the share of the legal foreign residents keeps if we made several robustness checks. For the local context, we will consider the population, the log of population, the log of tourist beds, to see how touristic a city is, a municipality is, because the unit of our analysis is the museum. But as I just mentioned, we will consider some context-related controls, so controls related to the municipality. We also consider the number of museums, just to test whether it is significant, and depending on the sign, it might indicate specialization or imitation. As to museum-specific controls, we tested several controls, but finally we decided to include the size, the age, because under the hypothesis that a museum founded more recently has more public spaces not dedicated to the collection that can open to external initiatives. The type of collection, because from the literature, we have noticed, from the case studies literature, we have noticed that contemporary art museums and ethnographic collections are more open to engage immigrants. And ownership and management type, which, because under the hypothesis that each type of management can give more or less degrees of freedom to the museum in engaging in promotional initiatives in general and in engaging the immigrants specifically. To handle possible endogeneity, we consider also regional dummies, because basically museum policies and residential location choices of immigrants, that is both the dependent and one of the target regressors, may both depend on local economic conditions. So we introduce the regional dummies. This is what emerges from our results of the model we consider as full in the end is the model number 8. We first test with model number 1 the influence of the parties, and we find significant influence of the vote shares on implementing an pro-immigrants policy or not. In the second model, we include only population, which turns out to be significant, but strangely it is negative. In the third model, the significance of parties disappears. In the fourth model, considering, and so forth, until model number 8. In the model number 8, compared to the previous versions, we see that we introduced regional dummies. The introduction of regional dummies basically makes the significance of the sort of deletes somehow the significance of the foreign population. So there seems to be a foreign population size effect, but this very much depends on the regional context, because when we introduce the regional dummies, this significance disappears. But the most important thing, looking at the parties, that is at the voice of the voters, is that the only sign that keeps across all models is the negative sign of Lega Nord voters. It is negative and robust and significant. So, whereas the one of other parties in model 1 shows some significance but gradually disappears. So we might conclude that there is a significant relationship between the Lega Nord voters. Actually, there is a significant negative correlation between the votes to Lega Nord and the implementation of pro-immigrants policies. Just a quick overview at the sign of controls. We find that basically in deciding whether to implement a policy for migrants, museums' characteristics matter. Size of the museum, the young age, whether the museum is a contemporary art one or hosts ethnographic collections. They are all positive and statistically significant, which means that the type of museum matters, and that these characteristics are influential to decide whether to promote a pro-immigrant promotion policy. It is interesting that outsourced museums show a lower probability to engage immigrant audiences. The sign is significantly negative. Maybe it can be an indication of a bias for the production of revenue generating services. We also found that other local context coverage are not significant. So whether the population, the native population size is big or not, it doesn't matter. Or whether the city has a tourist vocation doesn't matter, among others. Let's switch to a regional focus. We apply the same model, number 8, that is the one surrounded by the black box I showed previously. We applied the same model with the same coverage to several sub-samples of museums. As you can see, besides the 10% significance of Lega Nord and central-right parties in the north of Italy, within the north of Italy, there doesn't seem to be any effect in the target regressors within each of the considered areas. Consider sub-areas, that is North, Center, Southern Islands, non-Northern museums, Northeast and Northwest. So it seems that the significance appears to be robust only if we consider Italy as a whole. So when geographical differences come into effect. We also tested the same model on 2 subsamples of NUTS-3 capital cities and non-NUTS-3 capital cities. And again, the sign of Lega Nord keeps, it is still negative. We also consider possible classification of the municipalities according to their remoteness. Recently, there has been an upsurge of interest on the discussion about internal areas. That is, whether remoteness can, our guess is that maybe remoteness can be influential to the sentiment of the people. But again, the Lega Nord sign keeps, and considering both a classification of internal areas in 6 categories, a gradual from the most central to the most remote, and the one of the last column, that is the classification in 2 categories, whether the area is remote or not. In both the last 2 columns, the sign, the significance of internal areas dummies doesn't appear. There is no significance for internal areas, but still the Lega Nord sign, negative sign of significance keeps. We also investigated whether this significance of the Lega Nord sign can be attributed to the influence of the local patrons, of the local politicians on the museum's policies. So this is relevant to Italian museums because the majority of public museums are, as I just mentioned, are owned by municipalities. And so in case the municipality is somehow ruled by a Lega Nord representative, or there is some influence of the Lega Nord, of a Lega Nord representative in the council, in this case, there can be a sort of bias, because museums curators can be very much careful of the local patrons' agenda, political agenda. So what we did was to insert a dummy in models number 10, 11, and 12 on whether the museum was owned by the municipality, was a municipality museum. We also introduced a Lega Moon dummy, which measures whether for the presence of Lega Nord in the municipal council. All tend to be significant. So it seems like there is no patrons effect. The same emerges also if we consider the restricted sample of museums owned by municipalities. That is, overall, it seems that the decision to take a promotion policy or not quite depends on the voice, on the opinion of locals, rather than on the presence of local representatives having an anti-immigrant agenda. We also considered alternative measures of foreign residents. We considered, for instance, the growth of the local immigrant community between 2012 and 2015, just to proxy the increase in the number of immigrants of those years, which was very present in the media. We also consider the immigrants' area of origin and the fractionalization index, but in all the cases, results keep robust. And mostly the foreign population never turns significant. I would also mention that we made additional robustness checks. We considered alternative political variables like the extreme right vote shares, left parties vote shares, the election turnout to measure the disaffection of protest, the interaction between vote shares and foreign residents, and in any case, the main findings keep. We also introduced more museums controls, which never turned out to be significant. We also changed our model. We used the mixed regression models with random coefficients, and basically we found that key findings persisted. So our conclusions are the following ones. When it comes to museums' commitment to immigrant integration, it seems that museums' characteristics matter, but also the sentiment, the voice of residents, of natives, is likely to matter. We found that a particular kind of voice, the one represented by Lega Nord, a self-declared anti-immigration party, is associated with lower probability for a museum to implement promotion policy. And we found that also that the promotion policy takes place irrespectively of the fact that immigrant population, or irrespectively of the immigrant population size, because our initial guess that the more the immigrants, the more the number of policies, doesn't seem to have support in our data. Our results, although they are correlations, they give a sign that the museum director's agenda can be influenced by the local political context. But on the other side, we cannot exclude there are still phenomena related to the warm glow or a wish to increase the reputation, their reputation with the peers. That is, museum directors can be interested in that, in not being less than their peers. But also this can happen because, again, we are talking after all about a very good. So cultural non-profit organizations are, after all, policymakers. They act as policymakers providing public goods. And it seems that the decision not to engage may come from the fear to lose consensus. If they lose consensus, they might have less visitors in the museums. We are wondering, but this is an open question that in our view is worthwhile to investigate, if these mechanisms may apply also to other institutions, theaters or schools or hospitals. We think that in the end, putting obstacles to integration policies clashes with the community's best interest in the long run. The recent populist vision is is prevalently related to the short run, and it contrasts with what we have been showing, that is the need to adopt ad hoc integration policies to promote development and economic growth through the integration and to favor the future prosperity of both natives and immigrant population. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Raffaele. And now we take just a little break, 5-minute break, and then we'll be back with the question time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We are back with Raffaele. First of all, Raffaele, thank you very much for your very interesting talk and presentation. This is, in my opinion, a relevant topic at the moment under investigated. So, sorry. Okay, I apologize, but I had some noises with my PC. Start again. I was talking about the relevance of the topic you talked about, because yes, we know there is a wide acknowledgement that cultural institutions like museum can play a role in socialization and in the intercultural dialogue, and so in the integration process. I have some curiosity, some questions about, but first of all, it could be interesting to run the analysis without the effect of the Lega party, but I don't know if the census data that are in 2015, if this analysis could, you have data for previous years in which Lega was not at the power. My second curiosity is that we are in a sort of cul-de-sac, because both public museum and outsourced museum show negative propensity to be committed to immigrant integration. No? So, in your opinion, what could be the policies to go out to this trap, no? Because as you say, there is a lot of concern in both for both structure of museum. Thanks, Raffaele.
Shall I give a reply now, or okay? Should I listen to the others? Okay, I will give you a reply to your 2 points. Many thanks, Alessandro, for your comments. Your first question, our analysis was done by stressing the model in several ways. We made a lot of trials, but with the available data, that is the 2013 data, but the robust finding persisted, and the lack of significance of other parties still persisted. So with the data I used for this presentation, results continue to keep also stressing the model in several ways. I agree that a sort of analysis, if data were available, can be run in previous years. There is a similar survey in 2011. Actually, it is a census. A museum census was held in 2011. So, but there was not exactly this question. The question in 2011 was whether the museums had initiatives for minorities in general. The question changed to migrants in the 2015 version. So applying the same analysis with past data, we don't have the same dependent variable on the one side. On the other side, prospectively, if data were available for future editions of the census, yes, it could be very much interesting to see how this influence has evolved. Because as we know, the Lega and also other parties' shares of votes have evolved over the time, because the voice of the voters has changed over the time. And parties have tried to interpret it in several ways. For instance, Fratelli d'Italia has grown very much in the last years. So having more recent data would help to detect whether this relationship is robust over the time, if it keeps or not. I don't know what to expect, because but another advantage of the 2015 data was that, if you remember, Lega, well, actually, there were data from 2013 elections. At that year, Lega came out from public scandals on financing. So what we catch with this vote share is the core voters of Lega. So those that are more related to the authentic agenda of that party. Now we know that nowadays Lega has evolved to include a broader voice, and so it has gained in consensus. So I'm expecting that over the time this relationship may change a bit, but this is only my perception.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions by attendees. The first is Masoud Ghazi. Please, Masoud.
Hi, Raffaele. Thank you very much for your presentation and your talk. I really enjoyed listening to you. But there are some points that I would like to share with you. First of all, regarding the geographical distribution of all these museums that accommodate immigration policies inside them, whether they are morely concentrated on the north, or do you have also samples in the south as well? This is one point, and I'm for the curiosity, because I couldn't understand it very well. My apologies for this question. But you have also mentioned regarding a questionnaire that was conducted inside the museums, right? And you have the share of migrants and native. Then, of course, we know that culture consumption is not free of charges. All these, activities were free, or the attendees had to pay a fee for visiting. So if it is a fee involved, of course, we know that because migrants were, low educated and low income people, the consumption is already biased, because of the fact that they cannot attend certain activities. And most importantly, can you differentiate between European migrants and non-European migrants? And one of the control variables in your model was the share of migrants in local community, right? Again, the same holds there. Do you have Europeans and non-Europeans? And also whether you have legal migrants or illegal migrants are also involved there. And what happens, for example, if the share of illegal migrants is high in a community and compared with legal migrants? Does that change the perspective? No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Masoud. Well, I'm going to show you one of the slides. I'm showing you what the territorial distribution of migrants was, which was your first question. So let me share the screen. Here it is. Here in the lower part of the table, there is the number of units involved in each of the areas. As you can see, in the Northeast, we had 530 museums, 414 in the Northwest, 588 in the center, a bit more than 500 in South and Islands. So considering the four main geographical areas of Italy, the museums are quite well distributed. Of course, there is a response bias, because here we only include museums that gave an answer to all the questions we had in the questionnaire. But by the way, overall, we had nearly more than 2,000 museums, so we are quite satisfied about our sample size overall.
You mentioned that the response was 22.12, something like that, from the museum side, right?
Well, I'll show you.
The museum?
22.19% said of our sample said that they implemented these policies. Okay.
From the total, right?
Yeah, overall. Yeah, it is overall. Okay, it is not the majority, but it is quite enough to run an econometric model, in my view. As to the questions, as to the question on the fee, well, from the Giornale dell'Arte article, the one I showed at the very beginning of the presentation, I'm skipping there. Here there is a list of best practices of museums. All these, of course, had to account for the fact that they are involving a type of population which is not necessarily wealthy. So often they include a reduced fee, which meets the needs to favor the participation of migrants to visit a museum. But if you have a reduced fee, of course, you have more incentives to attend when you have a low income. It involves workshops, guided tours. Well, there is no explicit reference on the fact that they were designed for low-income people, but basically the kind of initiatives that took place, in my view, were not so much influenced by the need to be attended by people with high income. So it cannot necessarily be a problem, because we are talking about workshops. We are talking about involving high schools or medium schools or elementary schools in pro-migrants initiatives. We are talking about projects. Income could not be an issue according to the information we have. I'm showing you also another slide about your question on the area of origin of migrants. In one of our robustness checks, namely on this, we included the relative share of migrants coming from each of these areas. So we divided the world in areas. Of course, the reference category, as you can see, there's no reference category, but well, actually, from this list, yes, we excluded those coming from Europe and from North America, basically. These are excluded from our test. When we include the area of origin in our model, we have the model number 17. As you can see, the sign and significance doesn't change. The magnitude in absolute value increases a bit compared to previous models, but results are not ordered in that significant way. What I found in the test, we found that among the areas, there was a positive relationship with the share of migrant population coming from sub-Saharan Africa. So it seems that those areas where people from sub-Saharan Africa are more present are those where museums are more likely to propose pro-immigrants policies. But it was the only significant sign that emerged in both the linear and quadratic terms. Your last question on illegal population is very important. Here we measure only foreign resident population, that is resident population with another nationality, but officially recorded population. We don't have any measure, unfortunately, of the illegal population, which some estimates have been done, but they're quite unusable to our purposes. But of course, this is an issue for Italy because municipalities have been hosting migrants in ad hoc centers. So the problem, the perception of the problem can be different and not limited to the one proxied by the foreign resident population. Okay? I hope I answered to your questions.
Thank you.
Now we have a question from Sandro Montresor. Sandro.
Yeah, Raffaele, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed the paper. I mean, the topic is super relevant, and also the paper from an academic point of view is really well built up. I got a couple of comments. First one refers to the model that you actually put forward at the beginning, or better to say, the relationship between the model you put forward and the empirical application. Because as far as understood, the model, the theoretical model that you have is somehow sequential in a way. What you are arguing basically is that the incidence of immigrants in a place rises the share or the weight of anti-immigrant parties, and then this has got an impact on the pro-immigrant policies of museums, right? So as far as understood, the model is, as I said before, not really cross-sectional, while the econometric strategy that you follow is instead cross-section. I was wondering whether maybe in future or with these data or with other data, you might actually introduce this sort of two-step story also in the empirical application, also to attenuate the problem of endogeneity that you recognize you might have with the weight of anti-immigrant parties. And this is the first comment, really a question, I would say. And then with respect to the empirical application, when I was listening, you presented the results. My very first question was, in expecting and waiting for the results, who is governing the museum and who is actually responding to the question about the existence of a pro-immigrant policy. As far as the governance of a museum, I do think that is crucial. I've seen that you control somehow for a number of features of respondent museums, but I'm sorry, I think that I missed whether the governance of a museum is there. So very pragmatically, to which party does the director of a museum belong? Is there a sort of political background of the directive board of a museum? Because I guess that the policy that the museum implements reacts directly to the political belonging of the directors and maybe indirectly to the share of votes of that party. Okay, so this is the first question that I have. Well, the second question about who is responding may be more technical. I suspect that there could be some risk of response bias. So I'm wondering, first of all, who is actually responding to the question is always the director or someone who is in charge of institution. And again, sorry if I missed this while you were presenting. Have the respondent been provided with the categories of policies, typologies of policies with which to confront in order to avoid the risk of response bias that I mentioned before? And that's it. But I mean, very, very interesting paper.
Thank you, Sandro. I enjoy very much your words of appreciation, as you know. About the model, actually, the theoretical model was a static one because in our approach, we believe that the utility from the museum director comes from a set of factors. So it is a way to account for the utility functionally to a set of data, that is the number of immigrant audience, the number of natives audience, the number of actions decided for favoring the immigrants' integration. There can be some sequentiality. I don't exclude this, but in our we put the things easier. So maybe a more complex model would predict either the same or different things. I don't know, but as a premise, ours was a first attempt to adapt an already existing model to the specific case of museum and the specific case of immigrant integration. Indeed, there is need to have longitudinal data to see how causality evolves. But as you said, you know, we don't have enough data to do that. As to endogeneity, we asked ourselves whether, you know, what kind of endogeneity can take place. Maybe, you know, we try to overcome the omitted variable bias by including regional dummies, and this is relevant because when we include regional dummies, things change. So we kept regional dummies. We love regional dummies because they changed the view of the things. They changed our estimates, and we're happy of this. Another source of endogeneity can derive from the fact that, you know, we set the foreign population, the share of foreign population, explaining whether the museum took migrants' policies. It is unlikely that whether the museum took migrants' policies can influence the decision for the population to reside in that area. So we cannot exclude that a foreign resident decides to come to visit, to live to Palermo because Palermo, for instance, has a museum that promotes an integration policy, but it is quite unlikely. So we excluded sort of endogeneity in the variables, but we care about endogeneity very much, and we try to overcome in the best way. But we are aware that some problems related to the time dimension of the phenomenon are still in. But ours, by the way, was a first attempt to stress the data we had. As to the empirical application, we included some proxies on the type of management of the museum. I'll show you. Sorry, give me a couple of seconds. Here we are. Almost done it. Okay. About the ownership and management type, we considered what we had. That is, whether the museum was either private or public. Within the private ones, we introduced dummies on whether the model, the museum was owned by a Catholic Church or not. Among the public ones, we made a distinction between public outsourced museums, public autonomous museums, and public museums with classic organization structures, that is totally depending on the cultural department that they are owned by. So we took into account the degrees of freedom each museum has in managing both initiatives and especially financial means. But the only significant sign emerged in outsourced museums. In outsourced museums, we found a significant and negative signs. It seems that outsourced museums care very much on revenue generating. So maybe they are less open to initiatives that consume money somehow, or at least that do not improve revenues as much as they expect. As to the political party the director belongs to, well, it is a very hard question to answer, because it was very hard to realize for each of the 2,000 museums to get this information. We broadly consider this issue, which is relevant, in the way I'll tell you, with this set of estimates. Here we only we in 10, 11, and 12, we introduced dummies on museums owned by the municipality. And 13 and 14 are, this is the subset of the 1,000 museums that is owned by municipalities. We introduced the control on whether the only party that turned out to be significant, that is Lega, was in the municipal council. So we tried to see whether there could be any influence effect by a local policymaker with such an agenda that is such to be against immigration. But we didn't find any significance. But I'm aware that your question is quite different, because you wanted to know how the political nomination of the museum director, in case it is public, can influence the action. It is a relevant question, but we didn't have enough data to measure that. But of course, we see this study as only the beginning of some discussion.
Yeah, because my concern is that that process could actually be present irrespectively from the share of votes that that party has got. You know what I mean? So once you control and you net out that effect, I can believe in the story more convincingly. Yeah,
you are right. Yeah, because there is some relationship that keeps between the appointed and the appointer. But we didn't have enough data, and it was very, very hard to see the political, derivation of the museum director. But by the way, we tried to overcome the problem, but it is a problem that is inside the data, and we cannot define because of the lack of the data. About the questionnaire, it was an official census, so the structure itself, or at least those responsible for the structures, were in charge of responding to the questionnaire. So it was not a survey specific to voluntary response or addressed to the museum directors. It was addressed to each of the Italian museums. So as you can see, you can imagine the size of these census, because it was the question was sent to all museums. So who officially provided the response that was recorded by the dataset? I hope I responded to your questions.
Perfect. Now we have another question from Valeria Pica. Please, Valeria.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation and for the introduction to these topics. That is really interesting to me, being a museologist, and so looking at this aspect and this field also from different point of views. I would like to share a couple of considerations related to the questions that both Masood and Sandro just asked to you, because probably the regards to the geographical distribution of museums that you investigated as the main institutions that are dealing with migrant educational activities, and namely, if I'm correct, you mentioned the contemporary art museums and the ethnographic museums has the two types of museums that mainly organize or propose actually and offer to their audiences this kind of activities. And probably it is also depends on the geographical distribution of these museums along the national territory, because the main the major number of contemporary art museums are basically in the central and northern Italy. In the south of Italy, we have mainly archaeological museums or national galleries. And so it also makes a quite difference actually in terms of distribution. And regards instead governance of museums, it is also important to take into account that basically the educational activities that museums proposes are not always in charge of the director or the a museum organization. But since the mid-1990s, after the Ronquet law, the educational activities and all, among other functions of museums, have been delegated to private companies, private associations or private cooperatives that are organizing, that are in charge actually of organizing and designing these educational workshops, guided tours and so on. So it's not always linked, the director, to the educational activities that museum provide. So it would be interesting also to see who is directly involved in the museum educational activities offer to different kinds of public. And it could be also a question that I would like actually to pose you is instead on one of the last thing that you mentioned in your presentation, and namely related to the short-term policies and the long-term policies, and so the contradiction that we may have just when talking about migration policies in museums and migration, how to say, so to have a different approach actually in the in profiling also diversity in museums. So to see how actually a museum or a cultural institution in general can think and design this activity. Because obviously I have no data on that. It's just actually something that I was thinking, and when you were talking, it is also, there's also another element in the museum world now that is basically a year, in a year time, the museum professional and the organization of the museum professionals, ICOM, so the International Council of Museums, is discussing about a new definition of museum. We have had for more than 60 years a definition that was also referred to the educational, to the research aspect, to the idea of collect and actually expose a collection, but it was not referred to an intercultural dialogue or to an inclusion approach. Inclusive approach. Actually, at the very beginning, you were talking about integration policies, but basically in the museum world, we mainly use the inclusion policies more than integration, because there's a substantial difference between these two terms. And so what do you, or if you have in mind actually to go farther with your research and to see also how the current political and social situation due to the pandemic is changing completely the idea of what a short-term policy could be, and what museum in these terms can, or cultural institutions in general, can do actually to a better understanding. And just the last thing, but it's not a question, it's just a note. It could be useful, if you like actually to keep working on these topics, to see another project that is the MELA project. It was a EU-funded project from 2011 to 2015. So basically, it's just the same period you were investigating. And it was about European museums in an age of migration. and it is really useful. There are a lot of data that could be integrated with your research. And on the other side, instead, there's a blog, Museum and Migration, that is really up to date, and every day you can find new articles, new stories, or exhibitions and information and data of any kind about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria, for raising the points. And I will start from the last point. I thank you for pointing of these very interesting initiatives out. Well, about the geographical distribution, geography matters very much in depicting this relationship. And this is testified by our empirical findings, because everything changes completely when we introduce regional dummies. So the model, we cannot think of depicting such a relationship without including regional dummies. It is true what you say. It is true that the concentration of some types of museums is more in certain parts of Italy than in others. And our model tries to control simultaneously for all these things. And again, what you point out is true, and I totally agree, also because it comes from our data. We cannot evaluate this relationship without accounting for the geography. The second point, well, educational activities are in charge of, are outsourced. I would distinguish between the decision on whether to take an educational activity or not and the execution of that educational activity. So we are meaning with our work that the political responsibility inside the museum to undertake certain policies is in charge of the director, indeed. And this is an hypothesis which is which may vary. Which may vary across. Sorry, my phone ringed. I forgot to switch it off. This way of behaving can vary across the museums, but basically, it is hard to weight how much of the decision is in charge of the director, which in our view has, you know, as a manager of the structure, has a responsibility. And this is the way we should interpret our results, aware of the fact that the variability also in cultural policies, as we premised, is very high across Italy. And as to your third question, well, okay, inclusion and integration can have different meanings, but as we are economists, we try to combine the museum economics, the museum literature within an economic policy approach. So this is why we averagely came up with the terms you mentioned. It is very hard to say, but it is very much intriguing how the things can evolve after the COVID, because nowadays, you know, the immigration issue still persists, even in times of COVID. The movement of people indeed is much more limited because of restrictions, but when I'm thinking of COVID, I'm really wishing to know how things will evolve after the pandemics. Well, indeed, there is need after the pandemics to promote the positive contributions of any side of the population. And migrants' population are an active part of the population, indeed, and can be made much more active. So I personally wish that the kind of initiative that comes from the museum, or every initiative, can promote the positive contribution, can enhance the positive contribution of migrants, or as of every part of the population, to the economic development and after this tragedy of the pandemics.
Thank you.
So perfect. Are there any questions more? It seems no. Well, thank you again, Raffaele, for being here, for your super interesting topic. We really appreciate your effort. So the webinar series of GSSIs will continue, and next appointment is in December the 2 at 3 p.m. with Guido De Blasio from Bank of Italy, with the talk on politically connected cities. So I hope you really enjoy this moment in our webinar, and we'll say goodbye to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Raffaele. Thank you very much for having joined us. Take care.
Many thanks for your invitation. Bye. Thank you, Alessandro. Ciao.
Grazie, ciao.
Ciao Raffaele, grazie a tutti.